Thank you very much. I hope you're all full. I hope you won't fall asleep after lunch. So I'll be talking about one of the most interesting groups of birds in the world, the leaf warblers. And I'll be focusing on the ones that are possible to see in Holland, and including maybe one or two that might turn up that have not been seen yet. So the taxonomy of leaf warblers has changed dramatically in the last 20, 30 years. And in Peter's checklist, which was the standard checklist for the birds of the world, in Europe, the continent of Europe and Japan, Peter's recognized 39 species in 1986. And the latest edition of Howard and Moore checklist, which came out 2 years ago, recognized 64 species. So the number has really increased enormously. And the main reason for this is that a lot of species have been split. So things that were previously treated as subspecies of one species were upgraded to the rank of species. And that has happened for very many. For example, you all know of the chiff-chaff complex, which was previously one species and is now treated as 3 species. Bonelli's warbler was previously just one species, now 2 species. Arctic warbler, recently been suggested to be 3 species. The Pallas's leaf warbler is quite remarkable because there was only 1 species in the beginning, and now there are 5 different species. Yellow-browed warbler, 2 species instead of 1, and so on. And then 3 completely new species plus 2 completely new species in those species complexes have been found as well. So the number has really increased enormously. We'll just start by looking at this tree, and don't try to read any of the names, but look at the colors. The ones in red here were previously placed in the genus Caecircus. And most Caecircus warblers are quite different from the leaf warblers, so very brightly colored. And whereas all the Phylloscopus warblers look pretty much the same. They're brownish, greenish, some yellowish, very poorly marked, so to say. So this phylogeny, which is actually just based on a few genes, suggests that the genus Phylloscopus is not a monophyletic group. So some Caecircus warblers are more closely related to some Phylloscopus warblers than some Phylloscopus warblers to other Phylloscopus warblers. So this needs to be revised. And the latest Howard and Moore did this. They revised the taxonomy. I have deliberately avoided to publish a revision because I thought we did not have enough data with just a few genes, and we have much more data which we have not published yet. So we wrote in papers that we will wait until we've published a more thorough analysis until we revise this. But Howard and Moore, they did that anyway, and they came up with this classification. They suggested that all these birds in this group here should be placed in the genus Caecircus. And the reason for that is there are certain international rules that govern the nomenclature. So this group, if you want to have the same name on this group, the oldest available name is Caecircus. So that means, for example, the Arctic warblers and eastern crowned warblers and so on, they are moved from Phylloscopus to Caecircus. And also this group here, which includes the chiff-chaff and willow warblers and dusky warbler and so on, they will be called Phylloscopus. So they will retain the the old name. This group here, which includes all the small ones, like the yellow-browed and Pallas's leaf warblers, they will be called abronis. And these three species, which includes the bonellis and wood warbler, will be called radina. I don't support this yet, and I don't know whether it will be the final word. It might be, but I think in order to do this, one should have a more stable phylogeny, and this being based on just a few genes is not the final word. So we'll see what happens, but this might stand, might not. Anyway, let's look at one of those groups. The Pallas's leaf warbler, which I'm sure many, perhaps all of you, have seen in Holland. It's a beautiful little bird. It's got a wide distribution through Siberia and northeastern China, and it sometimes, quite regularly, struggles to Europe. The Pallas's leaf warbler complex previously, or still, includes several other taxa that were previously treated as subspecies or even synonymized with other taxa. So Cansuensis, for example, which breeds in this part of China, just rather small area, it was previously synonymized with this one here, Foresti, from central China. And Foresti was quite often treated as the same as Chloronotus in the Himalayas, with Simlensis in the westernmost part of the Himalayas. Yunanensis was also synonymized with these ones here. But these are actually very distinctive, and they've all got very distinctive calls and songs. Here's the Pallas's. Is it loud enough? And yeah, that's one of my favorite bird songs, actually. It's such a beautiful song, and it's remarkably strong, coming from a bird that's only this big. It's a bit like a wren. Wrens, as you all know, got really powerful voice. So same with Pallas's leaf warbler. And unfortunately, it doesn't sing very often in Europe, but it calls sometimes, and it's very useful to know the call. Is it too loud? Okay. It doesn't call as frequently as, for example, yellow-browed warbler, but it's a very typical call. It's very soft and fairly not very loud, unlike the song. So I'm not going into any details here, but I'll just play the song so you can get a feeling of how different they are. So Cansuensis. Very different song from proregulars. And then we've got Foresti here from central China. Also very different, and it's got two different song types. The other one is here. It's a very different song type. When we first started to study these, the songs weren't known, so it was very confusing to us. It took a long time before we got it all sorted out. And then the Chinese leaf warbler. Here. Again, a very, very different song. Very different. So all these have got really, really different vocalizations. The Chinese leaf warbler has also got another type of vocalization, which is given by both male and female. So it's not a proper song, but it's given only on the breeding grounds, or mainly on the breeding grounds. So all these have got different vocalizations, plumages slightly different. These two are the most distinctive one, the Pallas's and the Chinese leaf warbler, the most distinctive ones. The others are very, very similar to each other. We did a phylogeny which suggested that the proper Pallas's leaf warbler group is closely related to each other, whereas the Chinese leaf warbler is quite different from the others. Yellow-browed warblers and Hume's leaf warblers were previously treated as a single species with a wide distribution. Inonatus in Siberia, huge range in Siberia, the most frequent visitor to Europe in the autumn. Humae occurring in one area in Central Asia and another one disjunctly in central China, a different subspecies called Mandeli. And these are autumn birds, and as you can see, the main differences are in general coloration. Inonatus, the yellow-browed warbler, is usually more brightly colored, usually more greenish and with a bit of yellowish on the supercilium, more contrastingly patterned, whereas Hume's is usually more washed out. And yellow-browed has usually got paler legs, more distinct pale base to the lower mandible, more distinct median covert bar. This is usually much more subdued, less contrasting, often just the same color as the upper parts in Hume's. These are also autumn birds which show three typical yellow-browed warblers and a Hume's warbler. And note again this little, often a yellowish tinge to the supercilium. Not really, I mean, the name yellow-browed is not really a perfect name because it's never strongly yellow as in the Pallas's leaf warbler, but there's usually at least a little bit of yellowish on the supercilium, but that can be very, very hard to see, especially in the field. It's really, often really hard to see. Whereas Hume's has got a very nice pale buffish, so a pale brownish tinge to the supercilium. And look at the upper wing bar in Hume's. It's much less distinct. So here's a nice comparison with yellow-browed here and Hume's here, both fresh birds in the autumn. And notice slightly yellowish tinge to the supercilium, whereas it's more just buffish here. And this looks generally more washed out. You see the dark centers to the wing feathers are slightly paler than in yellow-browed. This anterior wing bar is much less distinct than in yellow-browed. The pale edges to the tertials, you can see that more clearly here. The tertials are more contrastingly patterned in yellow-browed than in Hume's. So the dark centers are darker and the white tips are whiter, so there's more contrast. The crown has usually got a greenish tinge, which is much less distinct or lacking altogether in Hume's. And the underparts of yellow-browed are often slightly yellowish streaked, whereas they're more uniform in Hume's and often with a little bit of brownish, buffish tinge also. You can see the wing bars here if you look at the differences. So more contrastingly patterned coverts in yellow-browed than in Hume's. The bill is usually got less dark on the lower mandible, less pale on the lower mandible, less contrasting bill in Hume's than in yellow-browed. And the legs are on average darker in Hume's, but there is a lot of overlap there. But fresh birds really are usually not too difficult to distinguish between. But in spring, they can be very similar. And here's here's a typical yellow-browed in spring with really contrastingly patterned, and here's a typical Humes. And Humes has, you can see here, the sort of buffish supercilium, often contrasting with the greater covert bar, which is much whiter. There's usually more or less the same coloration here. But this should be an adult bird, whereas this is probably actually, well, I'm not absolutely certain. This could be a second calendar bird. Anyway, second calendar birds, their wing feathers are more worn than in adults. So this anterior wing bar often disappears in Humes in spring. And the coloration is generally more grayish than in summer. And often the bill is darker too. So they do look more similar, these two, in spring than in fresh autumn plumage. In these pictures, the yellow-browed's got clearly paler legs than the Humes, but and also clearly paler base to the lower mandible. But there is variation in that respect. But the songs are very, very different. Here's yellow-browed. And here's Humes. So Humes has got two different song types. So Humes usually alternates between the double whistle and this drawn-out harsh note. And sometimes it's singing only with a harsh note, sometimes only with the double whistles, but I would say more frequently combining them, at least to some extent. So here's some more examples of spring birds. Yellow-browed on the left here, and Humes on the right. So you see this bird here, for example, it's got hardly any upper wing bar at all, whereas this one's got a very distinctive wing bar. This is an adult, and this is a second calendar year bird. Yeah, so they can be very, very similar in spring. Here's some sonograms of the calls, because the calls are very distinctive. And when you have a vagrant, yellow-browed or Humes, hopefully you will hear it. So then you can be absolutely certain. So I'll just play some yellow-browed first. This one here. And the next one. A little bit of variation, but not so much. Okay, ready for Humes? It's very different, isn't it? And here's another one. And the third one. And the fourth, slightly different. And the fifth, a bit different from the others. Much sharper. And then finally this one, which is more similar to yellow-browed actually, but still different. So the calls really are the best, that's the best way to separate these two species, calls and songs. So the greenish warbler complex, that's a taxonomic nightmare. I don't have a firm opinion on how many species there are. Do you? It's difficult, and the reason why it's difficult is because these species, this has been treated as a ring species, and a ring species is something that, in this case, has originated down here and then extended its range northward on the eastern part of the Tibetan Plateau, as well as on the western part of the Tibetan Plateau, and then met again. So the two arms have met. And the theory is that during this process, there will evolve differences in both these lines here. And when they come together again, they will be reproductively isolated. So they will not interbreed because of these differences that have accumulated during this period of time. And so this has been put forward as a classic example of a ring species, and there's been several papers in very prestigious journals about this. And the latest paper concluded that, oh, well, maybe this is not a perfect example of a ring species after all. And the reason for that is, let me say first, I will come to the reason soon, but I will just show you that you've got the subspecies or species or whatever, Viridanus, which extends its range even to Sweden, actually, and then throw Western Siberia to this part here. You've got Plumbetarsus, the two-barred warbler, in this area, eastern Russia down to close to North Korea, northeastern China. You've got the green warbler, Nitidus, in the Caucasus area, eastern Turkey. And you've got a taxon called Ludlovi in the westernmost Himalayas. You've got the nominate Trochiloides in most of the Himalayas, and that integrates with Obscuratus in China. So that's the picture. And the different taxa are partly easy, partly difficult to separate. The greenish warbler, Viridanus, the one that breeds in Western Siberia all the way to Europe, is fairly small, neat, reasonably small bill, looking rather dainty, and is usually quite easily separable from the two-barred warbler, which has got much more distinct wing bars, broader and longer wing bars. But the greenish warbler, Viridanus, is very difficult to distinguish from Nitidus. Nitidus is usually, the green warbler, is usually greener above and more yellow on the supercilium, ear-covered throat and underparts. But there is variation, and it depends on the light conditions, because under certain light conditions, you can't really tell those yellow tones. So these are pretty similar. And the two-barred, it's sort of fairly similar to the eastern Obscuratus from China, which is also very similar to the Himalayan one. So you could say that along the eastern part of the Tibetan Plateau, the birds get progressively broader wing bars, whereas along the western edge, instead, the wing bars become narrower. Here's the song of greenish. Okay, so it's a very long, complex song. And the song of two-barred is also long and complex. When you analyze the songs, in detail, you will find that the two-barred song is built up more of shorter blocks, shorter units that are repeated many times, and then change to another one, and then change to another one again. So they are distinguishable, and the birds themselves apparently don't have any difficulties in separating between each other. If you do playback tests on the breeding grounds, they will immediately know which one you're playing. The song in the Himalayas, this bird that I'm playing is from the Himalayas, but the Chinese one sounds fairly similar. It's much simpler, shorter and simpler. And the song of green warbler is more similar to this one. The calls. It's a rather simple call from greenish. Two-barred is more like a double or triple note. It's quite different. And green, the call of green is usually also more double, triple. It's usually distinguishable from greenish. But this is a very complex picture, and I'm showing it just to show you, just to give you an idea of the real complexity, and I'll try to explain it to you. This is from a paper that was published very recently, and this figure is based on a large number of nuclear markers, so a lot of DNA, a lot of genomic DNA. And this is supposed to be the southern part of the distribution, so along the Himalayas, and then extending north, so Pakistan, Kyrgyzstan, Western Siberia, and then China. So that's what it looks like. And this shows that you've got one distinct group in Turkey, which is Nitidus, the green warbler. You've got another group here, which is Viridanus, which is the blue. You've got Plumbetarsus, red. You've got Trochiloides, yellow. And you've got Obscuratus in China here. And the mix of colors here, which you show here, both blue and yellow, indicates that there's been a lot of interbreeding within the range of Ludlowi. Between Trochiloides and Viridanus in this area. There's been a lot of interbreeding. And also here in Obscuratus, you see a lot of, you see some part is typical for Obscuratus, not found in any others. But then you find parts of the genome that are very similar to Trochiloides and parts that are very similar to Plumbetarsus. And even in Plumbetarsus, you see a little bit of Viridanus introgression. If you look at mitochondrial DNA, which is represented by this inner ring here, I should add that the white parts, the white parts here and the grey parts here are geographical areas that have not been sampled, that have not been studied at all. But then you've got two main groups. One main group here in the western part of the range, and another one along the eastern edge. But so this is a very, very complex, complicated, tricky, intricate situation. And the good thing is that the birds are usually distinguishable by plumage anyway. So here is more pictures of Viridanus with a very faint single wing bar, and two-barred Plumbetarsus with usually two, at least one very broad, strong, long wing bar. And then you've got Arctic warblers, which is actually fairly similar to viridanas here. An Arctic warbler's got a very different song compared to the greenish warbler complex. Also, the call is very, very different. Very sharp call note. I'll play more of that later. So, if you look at the plumages here, if you compare these two, start with comparing these two. Arctic warblers a slightly bigger, stronger bill with a heavier bill than greenish, and it's got a more contrasting head pattern with a more prominent, darker, stronger eye stripe, which usually reaches all the way to the base of the bill, whereas in greenish it's usually more like a dark spot in front of the eye. And also this pale supercilium tends to be narrower. In greenish it's often slightly bulging behind the eye here. And in front it usually ends short of the base of the bill, whereas in greenish it usually extends a little bit across the bill. Legs are usually paler on average, but there is a lot of variation, and the bill is usually more contrasting with usually a more distinct dark tip than in greenish, but there is some variation again. So by far the best way is to use the calls. If you hear the birds, that's unambiguous. More problematic is to distinguish between some Arctic and some two-barred. And a typical Arctic is like this, with a rather short and not very broad wing bar, and no or just a very faint trace of a second wing bar. Whereas a classic two-barred in fresh plumage, these are all autumn birds, have got two very broad, straight, distinct wing bars, and especially the one on the greater covers is really prominent. Long and clear-cut and sort of straight, sharp. Other things to look for is, on average, the lores are less dark than on Arctic warbler, and on average there's more pale here, but it's not as distinct as in viridanas, so it's sometimes just like in Arctic warbler in that respect. The bill again is on average less contrastingly patterned, with more of usually slightly less distinct dark tip to the lower mandible, but there is some variation, and occasionally it's all pale in Arctic warbler as well. Primary projection on average longer in Arctic warbler, legs on average paler. The entire body shape is usually more drawn out in Arctic warbler than in two-barred. So there are a number of subtle differences. Now it's getting more difficult, because these two are fresh individuals, fresh first winter birds, whereas here are two worn adult birds in the autumn, and these the pale tips to the median and great coverts have become worn, so they are, you see, the width is not so different, and this bird has completely lost its anterior wing bar. This got just a very faint trace, so actually these are more two-barred than these ones. But you see, this wing bar is still rather long and rather straight, whereas these are fading towards the inner, so distinct on the outers and then fading rather quickly. And if you look at it in detail, you can see here that it's more like pale squares in the two-barred, pale squares, whereas in Arctic it's more like more diffuse, not so square-shaped, and you can count the number. You see, that's not a definite character, but you can see that this one's got several more feathers with white tips than in the Arctic warblers. So fresh birds shouldn't be difficult, but some worn two-barred can be very similar to some fresh Arctics. We did a study on the Arctic warbler where we sampled DNA and vocalizations from throughout the huge breeding range, from all the way from Norway to Alaska and down to southern Japan. A few different subspecies were described, and there was much confusion in the literature regarding these two, the ones occurring in Eastern Asia, here in Japan and on the island of Sakhalin and peninsula of Kamchatka, because some of the literature stated that examinanders occurred in this part and Xanthodrias up here, and some other literature said just the opposite. So it was confusing, but what we did was that we sequenced DNA from the type specimens of both these Xanthodrias and examinanders, and then we could tell which is which. And Xanthodrias is the one occurring here in Japan, whereas examinanders is this northern one. And then Borealis has got this huge range. In Alaska, Kennicott is sometimes recognized. They look very similar to each other. Whoops. All right. They looked very similar to each other, especially examinanders and Borealis. I would say I can't distinguish them in the field if I just see them. Xanthodrias from Japan is usually slightly more yellowish on the underparts, with a slightly stronger bill, slightly longer outermost primary. You can't see that now. It's usually very hard to see because it's usually you don't see it at all. But really, they're very, very similar. But luckily, they got. Oops, I thought I was going to play the songs here, but we'll look at the DNA first then, and. Let me just check if, yeah, okay. So according to DNA, all the birds from Alaska to throughout the northern part of the range fell into this group here. All the ones from Kamchatka, Sakhalin, and the northernmost island in Japan, Hokkaido, in this group, and all the other birds from Japan in a third group. And these have been separated for a long period of time. We estimated between 2 and 2.5 million years. So they're pretty old, these ones. And the vocalizations are quite different as well. So if we listen to Borealis, the northernmost one, it's got a very simple song, just a very simple rattle. In Europe, you can hear it in northern Scandinavia and Finland. The eastern part of the distribution has got slightly sharper song. But basically it's the same. There is quite a lot of individual variation, but basically the song is the same from Norway to Alaska, with the exception that the eastern birds have got these very thin, you can see some very thin elements here right at the beginning of each note. And those are typical for the eastern part of the distribution, including Alaska. Examinanders from Kamchatka, Sakhalin Island, and the Hokkaido Island in Japan. Things like this. So a very stuttering song with a repetition of a group of elements. So quite different from the northern Borealis. And Xanthorrheas from the other Japanese islands has got an even more complex song. And that's so like that, with more complex groups of elements that are repeated. Some call notes. There were some call notes in between the song strophes there. Also, the calls differ. So, Borealis, the one that you get in Holland regularly, or maybe not so regularly, but anyway, now and then, calls like this. Very, very sharp call. Here's another individual. So this is what it looks like on a sonogram, just very simple note. Examinanders from Kamchatka, Sakhalin and Hokkaido. It's got a more drawn out note. Like a short rattle. Here's another individual. Yes, a short rattle, so quite clearly separable. And then Xanthorrheas from the other Japanese islands, very different. So these differ in multiple ways, mainly in songs, calls, and DNA. There are slight differences in morphology as well, but they're more difficult to distinguish by plumage and structure. Another group of birds that turn up regularly in Europe is the rads and dusky warblers. And rad's warbler is a very, very sturdy-looking thing. It's the heaviest of the Philoscopus warblers we get here, and it's got a really powerful bill, very strong, fairly short, proportionately short bill. Both these are very brown-looking things. Notice, by the way, how different they can appear in different light conditions. See, I mean, if you held these birds right next to each other, they would probably look very similar. But here, in different light conditions, they look very, very different from each other. So dusky warbler's got a much thinner bill than rad's warbler, and its head pattern is the main thing to look at. Rad's got a supercilium that is more buffish in front of the eye and usually rather diffuse, and then it turns gradually whitish towards the rear end, whereas dusky is just the opposite. It's whitish in front, usually more clear-cut, narrower, and then turns more buffish towards the rear end. That's a very good distinguishing feature. Also, rad's got stronger legs, which are on average paler. It's got usually more contrastingly buffish undertail coverts. It's usually got a little bit of greenish tinge to the upper parts and edges to the wings. So there's a number of differences. Also, the song is very different, but of course you don't hear that very often in Europe. This is rad's. Very strong trilling song. Whereas the song of dusky is much more feeble, slower, lacking those strong trills. It's quite different. And I don't know about Holland, but at least in Sweden, dusky warbler at least has been heard singing. So, I mean, it's possible. But luckily also the calls are different. So here's rad's. It's a fairly low pitch. Slightly nasal and fairly low pitched, rather soft, whereas dusky is different. So it's higher pitched and harder. It's like when you click together two small stones like this. So they're quite different, the calls also. Oops. So here's some more pictures showing rads on the left and dusky on the right. And again, note the differences in different light conditions. And some rads warblers, never in dusky, are very yellowish on the underparts. Some young birds in the autumn are very yellow on the underparts, and you never see that in dusky warbler. But again, look at the really strong bill in rads warbler, and the broad supercilium with buffish anterior and then turning more whitish. Just the opposite in dusky. So more whitish and sharper in front and more buffish towards the rear. Here's just repetition of that. Bill proportionately shorter, much deeper. Buffish turning paler. Pale turning buffier. Much thinner, finer bill. So the eastern crown warbler was first observed in Europe on Heligoland Island, where a bird was captured a long time ago, very many years ago. And then it took very many years. And honestly, I never thought it would turn up in Europe again, because although it is a long-distance migrant, it breeds in the northeastern part of China and adjacent parts of Russia, and also actually in central China in some places, and migrates down to the southern parts of Southeast Asia. So it's not, also in Japan, sorry, in Korea. So it's not a really long-distance migrant. So I wasn't really expecting it to turn up, but it has turned up a few times since in Europe in recent years. Not in Holland yet? Okay, excellent. You're so lucky. So it's from a side view like this, it's actually quite similar to an Arctic warbler. If you don't see this pale central crown stripe, you can easily confuse it for an Arctic warbler. I mean, in Europe you would look carefully, but in places where both are common, you can just dismiss it as an Arctic warbler if you don't look carefully. But as you can see here, the crown is considerably darker than the upper parts, which is not the case in an Arctic warbler. And the bill is never dark. It's never got any dark on the lower mandible. The lower mandible is always entirely pale. It's also usually got quite nicely contrastingly pale yellow undertail coverts, contrasting with bright whitish underparts, rest of the underparts. And the song is very distinctive, very strange song, quite pleasant. Okay, that's it. So it's a very nice song. It's got two different song types. Also, that sharp song and that very nice whistled song, and they're usually combined. The call sounds like this. So it doesn't call. I've actually never heard it calling. I'm sure it must have some sort of call, but it's obviously not calling a lot. And I've asked others, and no, it's a very silent bird when it's not singing. It could be confused with this one, which has not been observed in Europe, and I honestly doubt that it will turn up in Europe, but it's possible. It breeds as far north as the Beijing area, and it migrates down to Southeast Asia. So the cloudiest leaf warbler, which was previously part of the Blythe's leaf warbler complex, which was split into 3 different species, is a possibility. And it looks very similar to the eastern crown warbler. What you should look for is, if you look at the crown pattern, this is rather uniformly dark, whereas this one is always much darker towards the rear. And this one, I mean, this is a bit like Arctic warbler and two-barred greenish warbler, two-barred warbler. So this one has got really prominent double wing bars, whereas this one's got a rather narrow single wing bar, sometimes with a trace of a second, but the wing bars and crown pattern are the best features. Also, this one doesn't have contrastingly yellowish undertail coverts. And this one does call. Well, here's the song first. The song is very different from the song of Eastern crowned. And it does call. Like that. This one has not been seen in Holland yet, right? Okay, look out for it. It's apparently possible because it's apparently been seen in the UK, I was told, recently. The pale-legged leaf warbler is somewhat similar to an Arctic warbler, but it's not green, it's brownish instead. So it's brownish, and it's usually very white on the underparts, and it looks very clean. The crown is rather grayish, darker and more contrasting with the upper parts. If you see it in poor light, the contrast between the crown and the mantle is a good way to tell it from Arctic, for example. It's got remarkably pale legs, so it's a good name, pale-legged leaf warbler. And the wing bars are very variable, sometimes very prominent double, sometimes just a single, and sometimes hardly any wing bars at all. It's very highly variable. It's got a typical song. It's a very, very feeble trill, very thin, high-pitched. And the call's very distinctive also, but can be difficult to hear. Just a very thin note like this. There is another species breeding in Japan and on Sakhalin Island, which is called Philoxipus borealoides, Sakhalin leaf warbler. I don't have any pictures of that, but it's extremely similar, and I can't really tell them apart by plumage or structure. They look extremely similar, and the calls are also very similar, but the song is very different, and it sounds like this. It's more like a great tit, perhaps. Very, very different from, really different. And it's genetically very distinctive. So for a vagrant in Europe, it will be hard to distinguish between them unless you take a DNA sample. So for those of you who might be interested, I gave a talk in China a few years ago about identification of Philoxipus and say circus warblers in China, and this is you can download this presentation from this site here. If you Google for my name and you come to my research web page, you will find it there somewhere. If you don't remember this, if you've got a photographic memory, it's no problem. Also, another thing I'd like to mention is this review paper on the Sylvioidea, which is also freely downloadable from the Chinese Birds web page. That's an open access journal, which has now changed its name into Avian Research, and it's also an open access journal, so you can easily find that on the internet. So thank you very much for your attention.